The American South has always been a place of shadows and secrets. From the bayous of Louisiana to the cypress swamps of Florida, these waterlogged landscapes have spawned tales of creatures that defy explanation. But nowhere has produced a more persistent legend than the marshy lowlands of South Carolina. For decades, locals have whispered about something that stalks the backroads after dark. Something that walks on two legs but is decidedly not human. Something with scales instead of skin and eyes that glow like coals in the darkness. The encounters are too numerous to dismiss, the witnesses too credible to ignore, and the physical evidence too disturbing to explain away. This is not folklore passed down through generations. This is something happening now, in our time, to ordinary people going about their lives. Whatever lurks in those swamps has left its mark on the land, and the people who dare to venture too close. South Carolina's Lowcountry stretches along the southeastern coast of the state. It is a realm of brackish water and Spanish moss, a place where the boundary between land and sea becomes uncertain. The region's defining feature is its vast network of swamps, particularly around the town of Bishopville in Lee County. Here, the Scape Ore Swamp spreads across thousands of acres. Dark water pools beneath towering cypress trees, tangles of undergrowth make travel on foot nearly impossible. The humidity hangs thick enough to taste. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds. Alligators glide silently through the murky channels. It is a primeval landscape that has changed little since prehistoric times. The swamp has always been a place of mystery for those who live nearby. Native American tribes told stories of strange beings that dwelled in its depths. The Catawba people, who inhabited the region for thousands of years before European contact, spoke of creatures they called the swamp walkers. These beings were said to emerge from the deepest parts of the wetlands during certain times of the year. They were described as neither fully animal nor fully spirit, something in between, something that belonged to the water and the darkness. The elders warned against venturing into the swamp's interior, especially after sunset. Those who ignored the warning sometimes returned with tales of glowing eyes watching them from the shadows. Others never returned at all. Early European settlers avoided the interior, claiming that something unnatural watched them from the shadows. Colonial records from the 1700s contain scattered references to strange occurrences near the swamps. One account from 1735 describes a plantation overseer who went missing while checking on workers in the lowland fields. Search parties found his horse wandering riderless near the swamp edge. His hat and rifle were discovered on the ground, but the man himself was never seen again. The search was abandoned after 3 days when several members of the party reported seeing a large, bipedal figure watching them from deep within the tree line. They described it as man-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too angular, moving in ways that didn't seem natural. But these were dismissed as superstition, the products of isolation and an overactive imagination. That dismissal became harder to maintain after the summer of 1988. However, to understand what happened that year, we must first look at the events that preceded it. The incidents that suggest something had been living in those swamps for far longer than anyone wanted to admit. In 1972, a paper mill worker named Thomas Marsh was driving home after a late shift. The road took him past a section of swamp about 10 miles south of Bishopville. It was close to midnight. The night was moonless and unusually quiet. Marsh later told his family that he'd felt uneasy the entire drive, though he couldn't explain why. As his headlights swept around a curve, he saw something standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop about 20 feet away from the figure. At first, he thought it was a person, someone who might need help, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized the proportions were all wrong. The figure stood at least 7 feet tall. The arms hung past where the knees should be, and the skin, caught in the beam of his headlights, had an odd texture, scaly, reflecting the light with a greenish tint. For several seconds, Marsh and the creature simply stared at each other. Then the figure turned and moved off the road with surprising speed. It didn't run on all fours like an animal. It walked upright, taking long, purposeful strides, and disappeared into the swamp. Marsh drove straight home without stopping. He told his wife what he'd seen, but they agreed not to report it. Who would believe them? And what could authorities do, even if they did believe? Marsh kept the incident to himself for years. It wasn't until after 1988, when other sightings became public, that he finally came forward. By then, he was in his 60s and no longer cared if people thought he was crazy. He knew what he'd seen, and he wanted it on record. There were others. A farmer named Clayton Russo claimed that, in 1981, something killed 3 of his pigs in a single night. The animals were kept in a sturdy pen with walls made of wooden planks and wire mesh. When Russo found them in the morning, the fence had been torn open. The pigs lay dead in the mud. Their throats had been torn out, with what appeared to be claws rather than teeth. The wounds were too large for a dog or coyote, too precise for a bear. Russo filed a report with the local wildlife office, but no explanation was ever provided. He repaired the fence and reinforced it with heavier wire. Nothing bothered his livestock again, but he never felt comfortable working in the fields closest to the swamp after that incident. Then there was the case of the Pemberton family. In 1984, they lived in a farmhouse about 3 miles from the Scape Ore Swamp. One summer evening, their daughter Julia was playing in the backyard while her mother prepared dinner inside. Julia was 8 years old. She was throwing a ball for their dog when she noticed someone standing at the edge of their property where the grass met the trees. At first, she thought it was a neighbor, but as she looked closer, she realized it was too tall to be any of the adults she knew, and it wasn't wearing clothes. Its skin was dark and covered in what looked like large fish scales. The figure stood perfectly still, watching her. Julia felt an overwhelming sense of fear. She dropped the ball and ran inside, telling her mother there was a monster in the yard. Her mother, thinking it was an intruder or perhaps a bear, called the police and kept Julia inside. When deputies arrived 15 minutes later, they found no one, but they did find tracks. Large 3-toed prints in the soft dirt near the tree line. The tracks led back into the woods and eventually disappeared in a section of dense undergrowth. The deputies took photos and filed a report, but no follow-up investigation was conducted. The incident was classified as a possible bear sighting, though the tracks didn't match any bear prints on record. Julia Pemberton is now in her 40s. She still remembers that evening with absolute clarity. She has said in interviews that what she saw was not a bear. It was not a person in a costume. It was something else. Something that watched her with an intelligence that terrified her even as a child. Her family moved away from that house 6 months later. Her parents never explicitly said why, but Julia believes they were afraid. Afraid of what might come out of those woods again. Afraid of what their daughter had seen. These earlier incidents paint a picture of something that had been present in the area for decades, possibly longer. But it wasn't until Christopher Davis's encounter that the phenomenon entered the public consciousness. Christopher Davis was 17 years old. He worked at a fast food restaurant in Bishopville to save money for college. On the morning of the 29th of June, 1988, he was driving home from his shift. The time was around 2 in the morning. The roads were empty. Davis was traveling along a stretch of highway that bordered the Scape Ore Swamp when his car began to shudder and pull to one side. He immediately recognized the feeling, a flat tire. Davis pulled over to the shoulder and got out to inspect the damage. The right rear tire was completely flat. He popped the trunk and retrieved the spare along with the jack. The night was oppressively humid, the air thick with the sound of insects and frogs calling from the swamp. Davis worked quickly, wanting to finish the job and get home. He had just finished loosening the lug nuts when he heard something moving in the undergrowth behind him. He turned and saw a shape emerging from the tree line. At first, he thought it was a bear. South Carolina has a small black bear population, and an encounter would have been unusual, but not impossible. But as the creature stepped into the glow of his taillights, Davis realized he was looking at something else entirely. The being stood upright on two legs. It was approximately 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark green scales that reflected the light with a wet sheen. The arms were long and muscular, ending in hands that bore 3 thick fingers tipped with black claws. But it was the head that truly horrified him. The skull was reptilian, elongated and angular. The eyes were large and round, glowing red in the darkness. The mouth was wide, filled with sharp teeth. As Davis stood frozen, the creature fixed those burning eyes on him and began moving forward. The motion was eerily fluid, not the lumbering gait of a bear, but something more purposeful, more intelligent. Davis's survival instinct finally kicked in. He dropped the tire iron and ran for the driver's door. His hands were shaking so badly that he fumbled with the handle twice before managing to yank it open. He threw himself inside and slammed the door shut. The creature was now just a few feet away. Davis could see it clearly through the windshield. Wet scales, powerful shoulders. Those terrible glowing eyes. He jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine coughed once, but didn't start. The creature reached the car and placed one clawed hand on the hood. Davis turned the key again. This time, the engine roared to life. He threw the transmission into drive and stomped on the accelerator. The car lurched forward on 3 good tires and 1 bare rim. Sparks flew as the metal scraped against the asphalt. But Davis didn't care. He just needed to get away. As he accelerated, he heard a sound that would haunt him for years. A screech or hiss that seemed to combine the worst qualities of a reptile's warning call and something almost human. It was loud enough to hear over the sound of his struggling engine. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the creature standing in the middle of the road, watching him go. For a moment, their eyes met in the reflection. Then Davis focused on the road ahead and didn't look back again. He drove straight home, the car grinding and squealing the entire way. When he pulled into his driveway, he sat in the vehicle for several minutes, his heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. His father heard the commotion and came outside. One look at his son's face told him something was seriously wrong. Christopher Davis told his father everything: the creature, the scales, the glowing eyes. His father listened without interruption. When Davis finished, his father walked around to inspect the car. The damage was extensive. The rim was destroyed. Deep scratches ran along the driver's side door and roof. They were gouges in the metal, as if something with immense strength had tried to pry the door open or climb onto the vehicle. The scratches were unlike anything caused by a tree branch or road debris. They were deliberate, purposeful. More unsettling was the pattern. The scratches came in sets of 3, spaced in a way that suggested 3-fingered hands. Davis's father called the police. By sunrise, investigators were at the house examining the vehicle and taking statements. The lead investigator was Sheriff Liston Truesdale. He had worked in law enforcement for over 20 years. He had seen his share of strange cases, but this was different. The physical evidence on the car was undeniable. Something had attacked the vehicle. The scratches were consistent with claws or talons. The depth and force required to create such marks suggested something far stronger than a human. Davis himself was clearly shaken, but coherent. He wasn't drunk or on drugs. His story never wavered under questioning. Truesdale had no reason to doubt the young man's sincerity. The sheriff decided to investigate the scene where the incident occurred. He drove out to the stretch of highway Davis had described. It didn't take long to find the spot. Tire marks from where Davis had peeled out were still visible on the asphalt. Truesdale and his deputies searched the area thoroughly. They found several strange tracks in the soft mud near the tree line. The prints were 3-toed and measured approximately 14 inches long. The depth suggested something heavy, something that weighed at least 200 pounds, possibly more. The stride length indicated bipedal movement with a gait of about 4 to 5 feet between steps. They took plaster casts and photographs, but the investigation hit a wall almost immediately. There was no database of known animals that matched the description. The tracks didn't belong to any native species. Bears left different prints. Alligators didn't walk upright. Large birds didn't have the right foot structure. Some suggested it might be a prank or hoax, but the evidence didn't support that theory. The damage to Davis's car was too severe. A person in a costume couldn't have created those gouges in the metal. The tracks were too consistent and too deep, and Davis himself had nothing to gain from fabricating the story. He hadn't sought publicity, he'd simply reported what happened. Sheriff Truesdale held a press conference 3 days after the incident. He confirmed that an investigation was underway. He showed photographs of the car and the plaster casts of the tracks. He stated that Davis's account was credible and that physical evidence supported his claims. The media seized on the story immediately. Within days, it had spread across the country. News crews descended on Bishopville. Reporters interviewed Davis repeatedly. The creature was given a name, the Lizard Man of Scape Ore Swamp. The publicity had an unexpected effect. Other witnesses began coming forward. People who had seen something similar but had been too afraid or embarrassed to report it. A woman named Rodney Nolf claimed she had spotted a large reptilian creature crossing the road near the swamp 2 weeks before Davis's encounter. She described it as moving with incredible speed despite its size. The creature crossed the entire width of the road, about 30 feet, in what seemed like 3 or 4 strides. She slowed her car and watched as it disappeared into the swamp on the other side. She told her husband when she got home, but they decided not to report it. Who would believe such a story? George Holloman Jr., a local resident, reported finding strange tracks on his property that bordered the swamp. The prints matched those found at Davis's scene. Holloman had discovered them while checking his fence line in early June. He'd noticed several sections of fence had been damaged, with the wire bent and twisted as if something large had pushed through. The tracks were in the mud nearby. He'd taken photos but hadn't thought much of it until he saw the news coverage. Now he wondered if the same creature had been on his property. Then there was the matter of Bertha Blythers and her daughter. They lived on the outskirts of Bishopville. On the night of the 14th of August, 1988, they heard something outside their mobile home. It sounded like metal being torn. Bertha looked out the window and saw a large figure hunched over her car. The streetlight provided just enough illumination for her to see its outline. It was massive, far too large to be a person, and it was tearing at the vehicle with its hands. She couldn't make out details in the darkness, but she could see that it was ripping at the vehicle's exterior. She screamed, and the creature fled into the nearby woods. The sound it made as it ran was distinctive. Heavy footfalls that seemed to shake the ground. In the morning, they found extensive damage to the car. The mirror had been torn off. Deep scratches covered the hood and roof. Chrome trim had been peeled away. Most disturbing were the dents in the roof, suggesting the creature had tried to climb on top of the vehicle. Bertha reported the incident to the police. When investigators arrived, they found what appeared to be the same 3-toed tracks in the dirt beside her mobile home. The pattern was identical to those found at previous sites. This was significant. It suggested that a single creature, or possibly multiple members of the same species, was responsible for all the encounters. The alternative, that multiple hoaxers were somehow coordinating elaborate pranks across different locations using the same fake feet, seemed far less plausible. The incidents continued sporadically over the following months. Most occurred at night near the swamp. Most involved damage to vehicles. The pattern was consistent but baffling. Why would a creature attack cars? Some theorized it might be territorial behavior. Perhaps the creature saw vehicles as intruders or threats. Others suggested the creature was attracted to the smell of motor oil or gasoline. A few even proposed that the reflection in the chrome and glass agitated it. Animals sometimes attack their own reflections, mistaking them for rivals. But these were just guesses. No one really knew. Kenneth Orr, a radio station manager and former director of the Bishopville Chamber of Commerce, became obsessed with the case. He believed there was a genuine mystery here worth investigating. Ore organized search parties and stakeouts. He interviewed witnesses. He combed through old newspaper archives, looking for similar historical reports, and he found them. Stories dating back to the 1950s of strange creatures seen near the swamp. Reports of livestock killed in unusual ways. Accounts of glowing eyes watching people from the darkness. One article from 1956 described a hunter who claimed to have shot at a large bipedal creature while tracking deer. He said his bullets seemed to have no effect, and the creature retreated into the swamp unharmed. The hunter's story was dismissed as drunken rambling at the time. One particularly intriguing report came from 1987, a full year before Christopher Davis's encounter. A couple driving home late at night claimed they hit something large that crossed the road in front of them. They stopped to see what they'd struck but found nothing. However, their car's front bumper was badly dented. It looked as though something had punched or kicked it with tremendous force. The metal was buckled inward in a way that suggested a concentrated impact from something extremely strong. They filed an insurance claim but never pursued the matter further, assuming they'd hit a deer despite the unusual damage. Now, in light of the 1988 incidents, their experience took on new significance. The swamp itself became a focal point of investigation. Wildlife experts explored its interior, looking for any sign of a large unknown animal. They set up camera traps. They collected samples of hair and scat found in the area. They interviewed locals who had lived near the swamp for generations. The stories they heard were unsettling. Several older residents recalled their grandparents warning them never to go into the swamp alone after dark. One elderly woman remembered her father telling her about the scale man when she was a child in the 1930s. He claimed to have seen it once while hunting. He described it exactly as Davis had: tall, bipedal, covered in scales, with glowing red eyes that seemed to look right through him. Another longtime resident, a man named Walter Briggs, shared a story that had been passed down in his family for generations. His great-grandfather, who had been enslaved on a plantation near the swamp before the Civil War, spoke of creatures that came out of the water on certain nights. He called them the swamp devils. According to the stories, these beings were neither human nor animal, but something in between. They walked on two legs like men, but had the skin of reptiles and the strength of 10 men. The enslaved people avoided certain parts of the swamp, not because of snakes or alligators, but because of these creatures. Walter had always assumed these were just old folk tales, meant to keep children from wandering into dangerous areas. Now he wasn't so sure. By late 1988, the lizard man had become a phenomenon. Tourists flocked to Bishopville hoping to catch a glimpse. Local businesses capitalized on the attention with lizard man merchandise. T-shirts, mugs, and postcards featuring artistic renditions of the creature appeared in shops. The town held a festival, but beneath the commercialization, genuine fear persisted among those who lived closest to the swamp. They knew something was out there. They'd seen the evidence. They'd heard the stories from people they trusted, and some had seen it with their own eyes. The sightings didn't stop after 1988. They continued sporadically over the following decades. In 2008, Dixie Rawson was driving near the swamp when she saw a creature matching the lizard man's description cross the road ahead of her. She described it as moving with shocking speed, covering 30 feet in just a few strides. The creature didn't look at her vehicle. It simply crossed from one side of the road to the other and disappeared into the darkness. Rawson pulled over and sat in her car for several minutes, trying to process what she'd just witnessed. She later reported the sighting to local authorities, adding her name to the long list of witnesses. In 2011, a couple reported seeing a tall reptilian figure standing in their backyard at night. It was staring at their house. They were watching television when their dog began barking frantically at the back door. The husband got up to see what was bothering the animal. When he turned on the porch light, he saw the creature standing about 40 feet away near their shed. It stood completely still, watching the house with those characteristic glowing red eyes. The husband yelled for his wife. By the time she reached the door, the creature had retreated into the trees, but they both saw it move. The way it walked was unmistakably bipedal, unmistakably purposeful. They called the police, who searched the property, but found nothing. However, in the morning, they discovered large, three-toed tracks in the mud near where the creature had been standing. Perhaps the most compelling recent case occurred in 2015. A woman discovered her van had been badly damaged overnight. She had parked it in her driveway the previous evening. When she came out in the morning to go to work, she found the vehicle in terrible condition. The front fender was ripped partially off. Long scratches marred the paint on the hood and sides. Tufts of coarse hair were stuck in the wheel well. She filed a police report and took photographs. The damage was extensive and expensive. Local news covered the story, and once again, the lizard man became headline news. Analysis of the hair samples proved inconclusive. The strands didn't match any known animal in the region. They were too coarse to be human, too thick to belong to any native mammal. The lab report stated that the samples were unlike anything in their reference collection. This case was particularly frustrating for investigators because it happened in a residential area with several nearby homes, yet no one heard anything during the night. No one saw anything unusual. The creature, if that's what it was, had operated in complete silence despite causing significant damage to a vehicle. This suggested either extreme caution or an intelligence that allowed it to move through human-populated areas without detection. Skeptics have offered various explanations over the years. Some suggest the original incident was a hoax that inspired copycat reports. They point to the media attention and the tourism boost the town received as possible motivations. However, this theory has significant problems. Christopher Davis never profited from his experience. He didn't sell his story or appear on paid television shows. He gave interviews to local news but received no compensation. The damage to his car cost him money he couldn't afford to lose. If it was a hoax, it was an expensive and unrewarding one. Others propose that witnesses saw bears suffering from mange, which can make them appear reptilian due to hair loss. Bears with severe mange lose most of their fur, revealing wrinkled, leathery skin that might be mistaken for scales in poor lighting. They can also rear up on their hind legs when threatened or curious. However, this theory doesn't account for several key facts. South Carolina's bear population is small and concentrated in the mountainous regions of the state, not the lowland swamps. Bears don't typically attack vehicles. And while bears can stand briefly on their hind legs, they can't maintain that posture for extended periods or move with the speed and fluidity described by witnesses. The tracks also don't match. Bear prints are distinctive, with 5 toes and claw marks clearly visible. The casts taken from multiple scenes showed only 3 toes. A few have theorized that what people are seeing is actually a person in a costume, though this fails to explain the tracks, the vehicle damage, or the consistency of reports over decades. Creating realistic 3-toed footprints deep enough to suggest 200 pounds of weight would require specialized equipment. Causing the type of damage seen on vehicles would require tools and considerable time. And coordinating hoaxes across multiple locations over more than 30 years would require an unlikely level of dedication and conspiracy. Additionally, none of the witnesses reported seeing anything that looked artificial or costume-like. They described living, moving creatures with fluid motion and apparent awareness of their surroundings. Another theory suggests misidentification of alligators standing on their hind legs. Alligators can rear up briefly, and in poor lighting, this might be mistaken for bipedal movement. However, alligators can't sustain upright posture for long distances. They don't have the anatomy for it. Their legs are designed for crawling and swimming, not walking upright, and they certainly don't have the strength or dexterity to tear chrome off cars. The tracks also don't match. Alligator prints are distinctive and easily identified, with 4 toes on the front feet and 5 on the rear. The casts taken from the scene bore no resemblance. Some cryptozoologists have proposed that the lizard man might be a surviving member of an unknown species, perhaps a type of bipedal reptile that evolved in isolation in the swamps. The Lowcountry's ecosystem is unique and largely unexplored. New species of insects and amphibians are discovered regularly. Could a large reptile remain hidden? The scientific consensus is no. A breeding population of 7-foot reptiles would require substantial numbers. They would need territory, food sources, and would leave far more evidence of their existence. Bones would be found, dens or nests would be discovered. Yet aside from the tracks and occasional hair samples, no definitive physical evidence has emerged. However, the swamps are vast and difficult to navigate. The Scape Ore Swamp alone covers thousands of acres of dense, waterlogged terrain. Much of it has never been thoroughly explored. The water is murky and dark, making underwater searches nearly impossible. The vegetation is so thick in places that visibility drops to just a few feet. If something wanted to remain hidden in such an environment, it could do so quite effectively. Remote cameras have captured images of known animals in unexpected places, proving that even documented species can evade human detection for long periods. More unusual theories border on the paranormal. Some researchers have noted that many lizardman sightings occur near areas with reported UFO activity. Lee County has had its share of strange lights in the sky over the years. Several witnesses have reported seeing unusual aerial phenomena in the vicinity of the swamp. In 1989, just a year after the initial lizardman encounters, a group of teenagers reported seeing a triangular craft hovering silently over the tree line near the swamp. The object had 3 bright lights at its corners and emitted no sound. It remained stationary for several minutes before accelerating away at impossible speed. Could there be a connection? A few have suggested the creature might be extraterrestrial or interdimensional in nature, appearing and disappearing through means we don't understand. These ideas remain firmly in the realm of speculation, but they reflect the deep strangeness of the case. Christopher Davis himself has largely stayed out of the spotlight in recent years. He moved away from Bishopville not long after the incident. In interviews conducted years later, he has maintained his story without embellishment. He describes the encounter matter-of-factly. He doesn't claim to know what the creature was, he simply knows what he saw. The experience left him shaken but resolute. He knows the truth of that night, regardless of whether others believe him. In one interview, he stated that he wished he'd never seen the creature, that his life would have been simpler if he'd changed the tire 10 minutes earlier or 10 minutes later. But he can't change what happened. He can only tell the truth and let others decide what to believe. The swamp remains dark, foreboding, and largely impenetrable. Those who live nearby treat it with a mixture of respect and caution. They don't venture in after dark. They lock their car doors when driving past. They dismiss outsiders who come looking for the lizard man as thrill seekers who don't understand, because understanding the swamp requires living next to it, requires hearing the sounds that come from it at night, requires seeing the way the water seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, requires feeling the presence of something ancient and unknowable watching from the shadows. Sheriff Truesdale, now retired, has said in interviews that he believes Christopher Davis encountered something real that night in 1988. He can't say what it was, but he saw the evidence. He spoke to the witnesses. He investigated with an open mind and found no reason to doubt their accounts. In his decades of law enforcement, he learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that something strange walks the swamps of South Carolina, something that defies easy explanation, something that perhaps defies any explanation at all. When asked directly if he believes in the lizard man, Truesdale carefully chooses his words. He says he believes in the evidence, he believes in the witnesses, and he believes that something created that evidence and terrified those witnesses. What that something is remains an open question. The tracks in the mud have long since washed away. The scratches on the vehicles have been repaired or the cars scrapped. The witnesses have grown older, some have passed away. But the legend persists. New sightings are reported every few years. Each one adds another layer to a mystery that refuses to be solved. Local researchers continue to investigate. Camera traps are still set up in the swamp. Plaster sits ready to cast any new tracks. The search continues, even as the years pass and the answers remain elusive. What walks upright through the Scape Ore Swamp on two scaled legs? What tears at metal with claws like daggers? What fixes glowing red eyes on startled witnesses before vanishing back into the primordial darkness? The questions linger as heavily as the humid air over the swamp water. Science offers no confirmed answers. Skepticism provides no comfort to those who have seen, and the swamp keeps its secrets, as it always has, and perhaps always will. The story of South Carolina's lizard man is more than just another cryptid tale. It's a reminder that the world still holds mysteries, that not everything can be explained by our current understanding of biology and nature, that the boundary between the known and unknown remains permeable. Whether the lizard man is an undiscovered species, a case of mistaken identity, or something else entirely may never be determined with certainty. But for those who have encountered it, certainty is unnecessary. They know what they saw. They know what left those marks. They know what looked back at them with eyes that burned like embers in the dark. If you find yourself driving through the Lowcountry of South Carolina late at night, particularly on those lonely roads that wind past the Scape Ore Swamp, keep your eyes on the asphalt ahead. Don't linger if your car breaks down. And if you see something tall and scaled, step out of the tree line, bathed in the red glow of your tail lights. Remember that countless others have seen it too. You won't be the first, and you almost certainly won't be the last. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. Have you encountered something unexplained in South Carolina or elsewhere? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing to hear more tales of the strange and unexplained. Until next time, sleep well.